I never belonged to you. I still remember the damp chill of that autumn evening in London, the fog curling around the lampposts outside, the distant sound of double-decker buses clattering down the cobblestone streets. I was 8 years old. My parents, the people who were supposed to hold me safe, protect me, and love me without question, they were gone. Not gone for a short trip, not gone to visit relatives or run errands, they had vanished. Left a note, small and perfunctory, that told me, in so many words, that I was now someone else's responsibility. That responsibility fell on my aunt, a tired woman juggling 2 jobs and her own children, who tried her best but could never replace what had been stolen. I remember clutching my small coat to my chest, shivering in the cold drizzle that soaked the cobblestones outside our flat in East London, and wondering if I had done something wrong. My brother was younger than me, barely 5, and he clung to my hand as if by holding on he could somehow make them stay. We were left alone in ways I didn't yet have words for, thrust into a reality where the people who should have been everything to us chose not to be. School was another battlefield. Other children had parents who attended assemblies, who brought them home from lessons, who sent letters filled with encouragement and love. I had a grandmother who could barely make ends meet, who did her best to feed us, keep us clean, and remind us we were loved. But her love, however genuine, was not enough to replace the hollow spaces left by those who abandoned us. I learned early that I could not rely on anyone but myself. That trust was a fragile thing, easily broken, and I had no choice but to protect the little girl I was. I became vigilant, cautious, hyper-aware of absence. I learned to smile even when my heart ached. I learned to laugh even when I cried in secret. I learned to navigate a world where love could vanish without warning. And, in the process, I built walls around myself that no apology could penetrate. Years passed. I survived. I thrived. I learned to navigate London's streets, the dark alleys and quiet parks, learning early to protect myself, to anticipate danger, to measure people by what they consistently did, not by what they said. And through all of it, there was a quiet ache for something I could never have, parents who stayed, who cared, who didn't leave me in a world too large and too cold for a child to face alone. Then, decades later, they returned. Not first in person, not immediately. Letters came first. Handwritten, trembling, filled with apologies and requests. They were older now, frail with age, claiming illness, loneliness, regret, and expecting me, the child they abandoned, to step in, to forgive, to heal the decades of absence with the love I had somehow learned to spare for myself. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I didn't even throw the letters away. I keep them in a box under my bed. Sometimes I open them. Sometimes I don't. They are reminders of the lives I never had, of the parents I never could depend on, of the girl who learned to survive without them. They are reminders that I am not theirs anymore, that the woman I became was forged in their absence, and that I owe them nothing. And here is the confession: sometimes, in the quiet hours, part of me imagines them failing, imagines them alone and desperate, and part of me feels a grim satisfaction. Not cruelty, not vengeance, but the knowledge that absence carries consequences. That the people who abandoned a child will never reclaim what they left behind. And yet, that same part of me aches for the little girl I was, the girl who wanted, so desperately, to be held, to be loved, to be seen. I learned early that love is not owed. Forgiveness is not owed. Presence is not owed. And they forfeited every one of those things the moment they walked out of my life. And so I continue, living with both sorrow and strength, carrying the memories of what was lost and the knowledge of what I built without them. After the letters, the calls began. My mother first, her voice trembling, soft, as if decades of absence could be undone with a single sentence. My father followed, initially formal, clipped, then gradually cracking, revealing desperation and frailty I hadn't expected. We were wrong, they said. We made mistakes. Please, can you help us? I listened once, twice, and then I stopped answering. I realized the truth, they weren't seeking me, they were seeking relief from the guilt that decades of abandonment had left them with. And yet, even knowing that, a part of me, buried deep, still wanted to pick up the phone. The little girl I once was, the one who had waited by the window for their return, still wanted to believe they could be better. That part of me, fragile and tender, imagined a reunion, a moment where everything could be forgiven. But that child had been abandoned repeatedly. I had learned early that hope from the people who left you is dangerous, it is a trap. I think back to my school years. The assembly halls, the parents applauding their children's achievements, sending notes, giving small smiles of pride. I had none of that. I learned to hide the ache behind laughter, to perform happiness, to keep my heart locked tight. I became self-reliant in ways other children weren't forced to be. I learned to navigate London on my own, to take the bus or tube alone, to understand that survival required foresight, caution, and resilience. I learned, too, to read people. To measure their words against their actions, to test consistency before trust. And I carried this lesson into adulthood, the world would only care for me as much as I demanded it. My parents had failed me completely, so I demanded more of everyone else, though sometimes, it was only myself. The calls became increasingly desperate. My mother would cry mid-sentence, pleading, begging, offering all the apologies in the world. My father, whose pride had always been towering, began to sound frailier than I had ever heard, asking for guidance, care, attention. And I realized something I had known all along, responding would mean letting them back into the life they abandoned. And I could not do that. Sometimes I imagine the words I could say to them, if I allowed myself the moment. Do you remember the nights I cried alone? The birthdays you skipped? The milestones you never witnessed? Do you understand the life you left me to live without guidance, without care, without protection? I imagine their faces, pale with shame, maybe even horror at the realization. But I do not speak. I will not give them that satisfaction. Survival demanded that I remain steadfast. The child I once was, the girl who had no one deserved protection. The woman I had become, forged in the absence of those who were supposed to care for her, demanded boundaries. I survived, and in that survival, I found the only justice I could claim, to live life on my terms, without letting those who abandoned me rewrite the story. Even decades later, I feel the hollow ache of what could have been. The life with parents who cared, the guidance I never received, the love I never knew. But I also feel pride, tempered by sorrow, for what I built in their absence. I am not their child anymore. I am the woman who survived, the woman who refused to be undone by their absence, the woman who will never again surrender to those who abandoned her. Then they came in person. My mother first. One damp, grey morning in London, the kind of morning where the drizzle seeps into your coat and the fog hangs low over the Thames, she appeared on my doorstep. In her hands was a basket bread, preserves, and a few things she must have thought I would want. Her eyes were wide, pleading, and her voice trembled as she said, "Please. I just want a chance to explain." I opened the door slightly, just enough to see her, to hear her words, and then I let the silence stretch. I let the quiet speak louder than any apology she could muster. She shifted from hope to frustration to shame, finally realizing that no basket, no words, no tears could undo the decades of absence. She left, and I closed the door softly behind her, feeling a mixture of sorrow and the faintest sense of triumph. A week later, my father arrived. Stooped, frail, leaning on a cane, a shadow of the man who had once been too proud to care. "We are alone," he said simply. "Please, we need you." I looked at him, really looked, and saw the father who had left me, who had abandoned the little girl who trusted him completely, who had chosen his own comfort over our lives. And I realized fully, I owed him nothing. I could feel the weight of every missed birthday, every ignored school event, every moment of fear I had endured alone. I said nothing. I let the silence stretch like an unbreakable barrier. It spoke for me. Decades of absence cannot be erased by frailty or remorse. They had tried to intrude, to reclaim a child they had abandoned. And I refused to grant them access. Not out of cruelty. Not out of spite. But out of survival. They did not relent easily. Letters continued to arrive, more desperate, more pleading. Medical reports, claims of illness, pleas for help, for companionship, for forgiveness. Small gifts arrived, food, photographs, even tickets to events I had never attended with them. I kept everything, meticulously, in a box beneath my bed. They were not invitations, they were reminders. Proof that they wanted to rewrite history without acknowledging the damage they had caused. And I could not forgive them. I could pity them. I could watch them, silently, frail and desperate, and feel sorrow for the lives they had lived. But I could not allow them back into my life. Not now, not ever. The child I once was, the girl who curled up in her blankets at night, wishing desperately for her parents, was still in me. And I protected her fiercely. I would not allow her to be hurt again. I would not allow the people who abandoned her to step back in and disrupt the life she had fought so hard to create. Survival demanded this, and I had survived. I had endured. I had thrived. Even now, decades later, I remember every absence, the empty chairs at school events, the unmarked birthdays, the milestones I celebrated alone. And I carry those memories with both grief and pride, grief for what was stolen from me, pride in what I built in their absence. I am not the child they abandoned. I am the woman who survived, and that is the quiet triumph no apology could ever erase. Time went on. Their visits grew bolder, their pleas more desperate. My mother began appearing at places she knew I frequented, the cafe where I often drank tea on rainy afternoons, the small independent bookshop I loved in Camden, even outside my office in Westminster. Each time, she would call my name, her voice trembling, her hands reaching out as if the years of absence could be undone with a single touch. And each time, I recoiled. Each time, I reminded myself that the little girl who had needed them could no longer be vulnerable to them. My father tried differently. He sent letters filled with medical reports, bills, photographs of old friends, distant relatives, even family pets we had grown up with. He asked for guidance, for attention, for care, all under the guise of regret. And I read every word. I felt the weight of decades compressed into those sentences. But I also felt my own strength, the armor I had built over 30+ years. I understood clearly that some wounds are permanent. Some parents, no matter how remorseful, cannot undo the damage they inflicted. I think often of the girl I once was, the 8-year-old who ran to the window every evening, hoping, praying that they might return. She wanted to forgive them, to believe in the power of apologies. But that child was not strong enough to survive. The woman I have become is stronger, wiser, and painfully aware of the consequences of absence. I protect her fiercely. I will not allow anyone who abandoned her to step into her life again. Sometimes I imagine telling them everything, laying it out clearly. Do you remember the nights I cried, waiting for your return? The birthdays you missed? The milestones you ignored? The life you abandoned me to live alone? I imagine the shame that would cross their faces, the horror of realizing they can never reclaim what they left behind. But I do not speak. I do not grant them that satisfaction. The justice I claim is quiet, internal, and final. I survived. I thrived. I built a life they cannot touch. Even decades later, I feel the hollow ache of what could have been the parents who loved me, the care I never received, the guidance that could have shaped me differently. And yet, there is pride, sharp and unyielding, in what I created in their absence. I am not their child anymore. I am the woman who survived, who learned to trust herself, who refused to let the absent dictate her life. And still, the memory of London streets, the damp air, the fog rolling over the Thames, brings a pang of that little girl's longing. She is part of me, always, and I honor her by refusing to let those who abandoned her step back in. I honor her by protecting the life I built from their absence. Survival demanded it, and survival has been my only truth. Years passed. Decades, really. The calls and letters slowed, the visits became rare, and eventually, they stopped. I imagine now that it wasn't understanding or acceptance that silenced them, it was frailty, illness, the inevitability of aging and death. But it didn't matter. By then, the child I had been and the woman I had become had already taken up the space they abandoned. Their absence had shaped every part of my life, had forged every boundary I would never compromise, and had built the resilience I now carried proudly. I am older now. I live with the echoes of their absence in every corner of my life. Some nights, I dream of them not as parents, but as shadows of what they could have been. I mourn the life I never had, the love I never received, the guidance they never offered. The little girl who curled up in the damp London fog, waiting for them, is still part of me, and I honor her by never letting those who abandoned her back into my life. I do not feel regret. I cannot. I survived. I thrived. I built a life that was mine, careers, friendships, love, laughter, all constructed without their presence. And that, I realize, is the quiet triumph of survival. The life they abandoned me to live became my strength, my pride, my inheritance. Sometimes I imagine telling them everything, the nights I cried alone, the birthdays they missed, the milestones they never witnessed. I imagine their faces falling into shame, the recognition that they can never reclaim the child they abandoned. But I will never speak. I will not grant them comfort. My survival, my boundaries, my life, all are mine, and I will not surrender them. I have learned that love is not owed. Forgiveness is not owed. Presence is not owed. They forfeited all of it the moment they walked away. The child I was deserved protection, and the woman I have become demands it. I carry both grief and pride, grief for the life I was denied, pride for the resilience I cultivated in its absence. Even now, decades later, I feel the ache of what could have been. And yet, I feel the strength of what I became. The parents who abandoned me will age, falter, and pass into silence, carrying regret they cannot undo. And I will remain, steadfast, living in the quiet victory of survival. I am not the child they left behind. I am the woman who learned to live without them, who refused to allow their regrets to define her, who refused to allow their absence to diminish her life. And in that refusal, in that unwavering strength, I find the only justice I could ever claim, the triumph of a child abandoned, who became whole despite everything.